So introductions then. So my colleagues from St George's will introduce themselves when they do their part of the presentation. So this presentation is in two parts. My part is really about setting the scene, and then Kate and Luke will talk about a deep dive into a case study that they've been developing at St George's. So I'm an accountant. I started out in industry in Hewlett-Packard Digital Laboratories, working with them on digital innovation, and that was through managing and accounting for the European funded projects there. It was fascinating. It was back in the 90s, and I used to come back home after work and talk about these fantastic things that we were going to do and how we were going to connect around the world, and everybody'd look at me in a slightly puzzled way. But now we see and take for granted exactly what was being designed by some really bright technical geniuses back in the 90s. So that informed really my whole career. I could see the potential of digital, and I then moved into consultancy, and I've worked in my career across higher education and professional bodies, and had leadership roles in both, as Dean of Students, for example, in higher education, leader of international, and my most recent executive appointment was as Director of Learning at ACCA Global. And for those of you that don't know, ACCA Global is the world's largest professional accounting body. I'm an ACCA qualified accountant. It's a huge scale, so I was responsible for 500,000 students worldwide, and also 200,000 members in a high stakes industry, so highly regulated. I reported to 20 regulators globally, some in professional body world in terms of IFAC and the Financial Reporting Council, for example, and some in the higher education world, such as QAA and HEFCE, and also through our lower levels of qualification, Ofqual, and the further education frameworks as well. So the reason I went to ACCA, excuse me, sorry, apologies if I cough. Both Luke and I are suffering from coughs at the moment, hence we're not with you. Excuse me. The reason I was asked to go to ACCA was because they wanted to do a huge digital transformation program. They wanted the whole qualification reviewed and relaunched, and they wanted it from foundation to masters modularized so that we could break it down into smaller qualifications, hence the work in micro-credentialing. And also they wanted to take everything online, so all of the assessment and learning online. Now, just to distinguish for those of you who haven't worked in professional body world, really the regulatory part of a professional body is all about the qualification. It's not necessarily about delivering the learning. And whilst we did deliver some limited amount of learning, it was really about the qualification. So I use digital both to democratize and give free learning, but mainly to assess online. I'm going to draw on those experiences in this presentation, and the presentation, as you can see, is titled Micro-Credentials, Where Do They Sit in the Current Education Context? And if we move on to the next slide, please, Luke. The objectives of this session are really to set the scene in digital education landscape and focus on it through the lens of micro-credentials. So considering the bigger trends which are underpinning everything that we're doing, the megatrends, and more particularly the drivers of change in tertiary education. I'm going to look at how these trends have disrupted education to date, and focusing again particularly through the lens of micro-credentials. Micro-credentials is a term that is often used. What does it actually mean? And how do we use micro-credentials? And what's the potential for further disruption? I will explore some examples of current micro-credentials whilst I'm doing that. And I am also a regulator, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we come to quality assurance. I'm going to talk about the common micro-credential framework. So just to clarify in terms of where I am in this debate and how I'm contributing to it, I have a number of national regulatory roles, and I also lead a consultancy on professional and higher education. So I have a portfolio career since I left ACCA a couple of years ago. Once I deliver my session, I'll hand over to St George's, and then we'll jointly identify and hopefully debate some of the themes that have come out of both of our presentations. So next slide, please, Lee. So setting the scene. So first of all, the megatrends. What do we actually mean by the megatrends? I'm sure we could all identify them, but just for brief revisiting, really the shift in economic power, the demographic changes that we're seeing worldwide. And one of the roles that I hold is I sit on the board of a set of education colleges in Nepal, and the average age in Nepal is 21.5 years. So on the one end, we've got that, then we're talking very much about Italy at the moment, obviously for different reasons, but the reference there is to the age profile of the population. So when we're looking at a country which has got a very young population and really strong educational and skills needs, but we're also looking at older population countries, they too have those same needs, and how we would deliver them through that whole lifelong learning agenda is really important when we're looking at the use of digital, and also when we're looking at the use of smaller broken down size qualifications. So shift in economic power, demographics, rapid urbanisation, climate change and resource scarcity, and of course the rise of tech are all the key mega trends, and they're all interrelated and feed into each other. And if we look more particularly at the tertiary level drivers of change in education, we generally talk about looking at globalisation, regulatory change, changing expectations and digitisation. So 4 key themes. So I'll just briefly touch on those. So when we look at globalisation, I mentioned my role at ACCA, and indeed all of my work, both executive and non-executive, addresses globalisation, the possibility of delivering across borders, and the challenges that this presents in terms of regulatory changes and regulatory agendas being different in different economies as well. So those are really important areas that we need to consider when we're looking at any disruption in education. When I talk about changing expectations, I mean that in terms of generational expectations. So when we're looking at Gen Z and the need for flexible anytime, any place, anywhere learning, how we respond to that with bite-sized learning and set-off points, and how that generation are actually voting with their feet is really important. But also the changing expectations from employers is also equally important. They're less keen to invest for the long term. They want job ready, as they call it, graduates, for example. And that doesn't necessarily present naturally from a traditional education system. And I look back at my own journey. I did English language and literature at Birmingham University, and then I had a graduate traineeship where my employer fully invested in me gaining all of my professional skills, in fact 3 sets of different professional qualifications. And that wasn't unusual then. It's much more difficult to gain that sort of support now. And then digitisation. I always think, having worked with digital all the way through, it's really important that we regard digital as a tool, as an enabler, as a way of extending reach geographically, but also extending reach over time through synchronous and asynchronous delivery, but also through being able to access things 24/7, for example. I've been involved in the design and delivery of chatbots with universities, having worked in both and led both professional services, libraries, and also academic faculties in higher education. So when we look at some of the responses to these megatrends, and in particular the drivers of change, then often we start talking about MOOCs, massive online open courses. So probably the most obvious response to the agenda, and particularly active, particularly in the media, I would say, in the first decade of this century. And I think the term MOOC was actually coined around 2008, although there were aspects of it beforehand. So it's all about being open to all, there being no limit on size, that use of digital to democratize, to deliver it in very flexible ways, to do so free of charge. So there are some key themes that have emerged over the first sort of 10, 15 years of MOOCs. And that is that there's been very high levels of educational participation, lots of learners at ACCAX, where we had our own MOOC provided by edX. In the first 12 months, we had over 100,000 learners registered. But they've got very poor completion rates. And everything we provided at that stage, not now, but everything we provided at that stage was free of charge. And providing things free of charge, although on the one hand, that's great for democratization of education, that's great for accessibility, it also leads to quite often poor value being attributed to the courses. A lot of the courses that were produced were very generic, and people picked them up and put them down. Nevertheless, by the end of 2008, 2009, over 900 universities globally had about 12,000 MOOCs available. Now, more recently, the themes that have been emerging from MOOC technology is the trends are changing a bit. Those universities that are involved are tending to add less new courses, so they're not going for quantity, they're going for quality. They're not going for broad and generic, they're going for deep dive vertical. And I think that's illustrated by the presentation from our colleagues at St. George's. So we're looking at more focused, we're looking at more specialised, and we're looking at an element of free that leads to a paid element as well. One of the other things that has arisen from MOOC technology is it's starting to be used for more traditional qualifications as well. So in 2016, in my role at ACCA, I co-launched with Dr. Mary Stianassi, who I believe opened the conference, although sadly I wasn't able to be there to see. Dr. Mary Stianassi and I launched a Masters in Professional Accounting, and we launched that worldwide. We went to Singapore, Pakistan, we launched it in London, we launched it strategically, physically across the world, and then online in every country. And the really interesting thing about that qualification was we delivered it through UCL using Coursera, so MOOC technology, but it was integrated qualification. And I think that's one of the really important features and particular potential of micro-credentials. It's about the meeting of professional and academic qualifications. So I think there are a couple of things from that sort of broad background that we'll come back to as we go through looking at both MOOCs and micro-credentials. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is an example of the ACCAX MOOC that I've talked about. So it's free learning, but whilst the learning is free, and again, it plays to the ACCA values of diversity and accessibility, to gain recognised qualification, so to be credentialised, then you need to take a recognised exam. Now that exam was digitally delivered, but it was very highly regulated. So next slide, please. So this is another example from ACCAX. It's a course that's not, it's been running for some time, but the next cohort has not yet started. We're not very far into registration, and already we've got over 23,000 learners registered for it. So you can see the size there and potential for reach. Of course, when it filters down to how many of those completed it, it would be really interesting to see whether it's, you know, even 1%. And it very much depends upon the nature of who's registering. So next slide, please. So here we can see, going into this a little bit more deeply, that it's short in length. So we're getting to bite size. So it's 6 weeks, it's 4 to 5 hours per week. It's flexible. It's a mix of synchronous and asynchronous delivery. And if you look at the resources that are available, it's delivered through virtual classroom, it's delivered through traditional journal articles, for example. It's also traditionally delivered through videos, and there are available language transcripts to help and to make it accessible. So there's a huge amount of flexibility, and the students or learners can choose which resources work best for them. So next slide, please. So then I just want to very briefly touch on what do we mean by a micro-credential, because basically it's a small credentialized qualification. But if we break it down a little bit more, what we mean in this context, first of all, I want to say what it doesn't mean. And that is certified attendance. Now, as an accountant, I do 40 hours of CPD per year, and some of it's got to be certified. Half of it approximately has got to be certified. So I do that, for example, by attending some courses where I get certified attendance. And that will lead into the debate that both myself and St George's are very interested in about engagement. So just having somebody in the room, be it face-to-face or be it virtual, does that actually produce engagement? So what we're not looking at here when we're talking about a micro-credential is certified attendance. That is just what it says on the tin. It's a certificate that says for a certain number of hours you were in a certain place and heard and received a certain amount of learning. So when we move into the world of certification, then we're looking at micro-credentials. So we're focusing on assessment and validation of a set of skills. So very often we're working with a work-related milestone. It's earned by educational achievement. It's probably going to be in a bite-sized format of some sort. It's going to use assessment to certify, which is going to be digitally administered. And then it's going to say what it certifies. So there'll be a transcript that says that it's certifying and validating certain skills and competencies. So Microsoft training certifications are role-based and set pathways. So you can develop your career through the Microsoft Academy. And that's just one example. So if we move on to the next slide, please. This is another example from the IT industry from Cisco. Now, I think it's really interesting that this has taken off and is very credible in the IT world. And that's because this is a world that is changing so quickly. And the employers want quick responses to being able to validate new skills as they emerge. And universities and traditional learning providers, like professional bodies as well, find that a real challenge, because obviously we've got so much in the way of quality assurance and validation to comply with before we get to actual delivery of qualification. So a micro-credential, it's agile, it's nimble, it can be done quite quickly, it's much smaller. It's heavily role-based quite often, and certainly that's how they've developed since they were first brought in. And it's developed around employer needs, skills and competencies. So if we move on, please, Luke, the next one is from the Institute of Export. So slightly different. This is about specialised skills, again, driven by market needs and employer needs for very niche, expert, vertical knowledge that is certified by a badge. So in that world of employment, that has a high value attributed to it. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned before that my whole career is as a regulator and also as being regulated and delivering to regulators. Within my current portfolio at the moment, I've got four regulatory roles actually. So 3 regulatory roles around the Office for Students and run around the British Accreditation Council. So I strongly believe in quality assurance being critical to valuing and adding credibility to any qualification. And I think that's particularly important when qualifications are new and emerging and people want to be able to trust them. So I'll talk about how we can do that in a moment in micro-credentials, but just to declare my interests, for the Office for Students, I sit on their Quality Assessment Committee, and that is a statutory committee brought in by HERA, and there's 5 of us that advise the board for the Office for Students on all things to do with quality assessment, and what's delivered by the designated body here in the UK, the QAA. I also sit on the UK Standing Committee for Quality and Assessment, and that's the committee that holds the keys to standards and quality for the UK. And I'm a teaching excellence framework panellist, so I'm a national panellist, so the institutional badging of bronze, silver and gold is obviously part of the portfolio delivered through being a TEF panellist. And my fourth role, I just mentioned at the beginning, is not to do with the Office for Students, it's to do with the British Accreditation Council, and I sit on the British Accreditation Council. And that's really interesting because whilst the Office for Students is looking at higher education, the British Accreditation Council is looking at higher and professional education, and many of those learning providers with British Accreditation Council accreditation, it's known as BAC, many with BAC approval will actually be in the private sector. So they may well be delivering their own badges, for example. So I've already talked a little bit about bodies that accredit. So basically they tend to fall into being employers, being professional bodies, such as the ACCA, and being universities. That's not limiting it to that, but that's where we see most of the accreditation coming on for the moment. Accreditation can be high or low stakes. I mentioned before that accountancy, law, medicine, and similar industries are generally regarded as high stakes. That's more to do with what your qualifications licenses you to do. So similarly, coming down to a micro-credential level, if your micro-credential achievement allows you to do something, then that can lead to it being high stakes, and of course that makes quality assurance yet more important. And how do we assure quality for micro-credentials? Well, we use what's known as the Common Micro-Credential Framework. So any high-quality micro-credential will be mapped through its quality assurance to the framework. So the framework, which is adopted by FutureLearn, the MOOC that was originally owned by the BBC and is now associated with the Open University. The micro-credential framework basically focuses on 5 key areas. The amount of time in learning, and it tends to say anything below 100 hours is not really a micro-credential within this framework. So it's about 100 to 150 hours. So bite size, but not so tiny as to be fragmented. It's aimed at levels 6 and 7 within the framework, the education framework. So what we're talking about there is level 6, obviously being the final level undergraduate, and level 7 being postgraduate. It entails a summative assessment, so it is formally assessed, so that might be through a series of tests, it might be through a digital exam, it might be through production of video, for example. So it can be quite flexible as to what, but it does require a summative assessment. And that summative assessment must be associated with very high quality ID verification. So we really need to focus on maintaining academic integrity. And from that, the accrediting body must produce a transcript. So those are the key elements of quality assurance required by the framework. So that ensures that we're looking at credible framework, credible qualifications that can be stackable. And what I mean by stackable is they can be a series of small micro-credentials that build up into a certificate, that certificate might build up with more micro-credentials to a diploma, for example. Or they could be nested qualifications where you take whole qualifications and then use them and to build together blocks. So you might already have a certificate, and that might lead to accelerated entry being recognised within a diploma. So stackable tends to be building from the ground up, and nested tends to be built from taking the final qualification and deconstructing it downwards. So next slide, please. So this is my final slide. So just briefly wanted to summarize on the benefits of micro-credentials. Most of these I've talked about already, but there are a couple that I haven't, which I'll briefly touch on, which I think are important as we move to think about future developments. And the first of those is by taking learning digital, we allow ourselves to measure engagement in a way that is very difficult to do in the face-to-face world. So I've done a lot of work around learning analytics, predictive analytics, and it's really interesting what you can learn about engagement through going underneath the learning that's been delivered and looking at it at a cohort level, and then looking at it at an individual level, and then contrasting that with input measures and output measures such as input qualification requirements and attainment. I think the benefits there are huge as long as they are used as part of a picture and very much focusing on them as tools. I'll just highlight again the accessibility of micro-credentials. So we might be able to reach parts of society that would never sign up for a degree, but would be happy to sign up for a very small qualification and feel that that was possible for them. And also the multimedia delivery, which makes it very accessible and can be really as accessible as you want it to be. So I'm aware of time, so moving on to future developments. Increasingly, there's a focus on micro-credentialing, and I think that's a really positive thing. I've been talking about it with commercial providers, universities, professional bodies, and actually working in it for over 10 years now. But increasingly with really credible players, such as the Open University announcing a number of micro-credentials a couple of weeks ago, with the micro-credential that St. George's is going to talk about at the moment, with really strong partnerships appearing between employers and both traditional and non-traditional learning providers. We've got the real possibility of extending reach and reshaping what we mean by bite size and step off, and valuing qualification at all levels. At the moment, when we register for a degree and then a student who finishes after perhaps completing their first year of study and goes away with a certificate of higher education, is seen as a failure of the system, when actually that's a really important building block, and they've achieved their learning, and that learning could be produced as a micro-credential and could be very credible and contribute to their career.